Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, let me begin with a startling fact. America has just lost the Arctic. Not in a battle, not with a war, not even with a confrontation. No, America lost it without so much as a fight. And the real question we have to ask is why? Why does the richest country in the history of the world surrender such a strategic, resource rich, and geopolitically vital region without lifting a finger? The answer, as usual, lies not in geography, not in climate, but in economics, capitalist economics. The Arctic is rapidly emerging as one of the most valuable regions in the 21st century. Melting ice, accelerated by climate change, has opened new shipping lanes, new trade routes, and new access to vast untapped reserves of oil, gas, and minerals. Countries like Russia, China, and even smaller Arctic nations are rushing in, building icebreakers, stations, pipelines, and long-term strategies to dominate this frontier. And the United States, it sat back. It let its corporate and political elites focus on short-term profits, quarterly reports, and election cycles rather than long-term national or planetary interests. This is the story of capitalism's failure. You see, capitalism cannot plan for the long term. It is structurally addicted to the immediate gain, the next dividend, the next campaign donation. Russia built a fleet of icebreakers because it sees the Arctic as the new Middle East. China invested billions in Arctic research and infrastructure because it sees the future of global trade routes. Meanwhile, American corporations and the politicians who serve them couldn't be bothered. Why? Because they were too busy moving production to cheaper labor markets abroad, too busy funneling wealth into stock buybacks, too busy cutting taxes for billionaires. Think about it. America spends trillions on wars in the Middle East, endless military interventions that bleed resources dry. But when it comes to the Arctic, the real frontier of the future economy, nothing. No investment, no preparation, no leadership. And here's the bitter irony. The very climate crisis that created these new Arctic opportunities was driven largely by the fossil fuel capitalism America champions. So the U.S. created the problem, but then failed to seize the opportunity it opened. That's not just bad policy, that's systemic dysfunction. And I want you to notice something else. Losing the Arctic is not only a geopolitical defeat, it is a symbol of the broader decline of U.S. global leadership. We are watching the unraveling of an empire in real time, an empire so beholden to the profit motive that it cannot even defend its own long-term interests, an empire that clings to ideology. Free markets will solve everything, as other nations outplan, outinvest, and outstrategize it. America's strategic failure in the Arctic is not simply a story about geography or climate. It is a story about how a global superpower endowed with unmatched resources, technological capacity, and wealth failed to act decisively in one of the most critical regions of the 21st century. The Arctic is not some remote, icy wasteland. It is a new frontier of global power where melting ice has opened shipping routes that drastically shorten travel time between Europe and Asia, where untapped reserves of oil, gas, and rare minerals lie waiting, and where military positioning could determine the balance of power for generations to come. Russia understood this. China understood this. Even smaller Arctic nations like Norway and Canada understood this. The United States, however, watched from the sidelines as others moved in, revealing not just a gap in policy, but a profound failure of strategy. Consider Russia's approach. Over the past 2 decades, Moscow has invested heavily in its Arctic presence, building the world's largest fleet of icebreakers, ships designed to navigate and dominate icy waters. It has established military bases along its northern coast, upgraded ports, and developed infrastructure to ensure it controls the northern sea route. This is not an accident, it is a deliberate, long-term plan. Russia sees the Arctic as its new Middle East, a vast source of energy and trade leverage in a world hungry for resources. By acting early, Russia secured a dominant position that the United States now has no realistic way of challenging. Now compare that with the American response. The United States, with all its wealth, has only a handful of aging icebreakers, many of them decades old. Investment in Arctic infrastructure has been minimal, piecemeal, and politically neglected. No grand strategy was ever formulated, no serious commitment made, and no sustained funding allocated. American leaders, swayed by corporate donors and partisan distractions, focused instead on short-term economic gains, military entanglements in the Middle East, and tax cuts for the wealthiest citizens. The Arctic was treated as peripheral, a luxury rather than a necessity, despite the clear evidence that it was fast becoming a central stage of global competition. This inaction is more than oversight. It is emblematic of how American capitalism shapes foreign policy. U.S. corporations saw little immediate profit in Arctic development, and without corporate lobbying pressure, politicians found no incentive to act. The short-term mindset of the profit system, demanding returns within quarters, not decades, clashed directly with the long-term planning needed to secure Arctic dominance. Russia and China, by contrast, operate through systems that can plan decades ahead, marshal state resources, and make strategic investments without needing to justify them in terms of immediate profit. That fundamental structural difference explains why they surged forward while the United States stood still. The consequences are profound. By failing to establish a serious Arctic presence, America has ceded influence over new global trade routes. The Northern Sea Route, managed by Russia, can cut shipping time between Asia and Europe by up to 40% compared to the traditional Suez Canal route. This means cheaper shipping, faster supply chains, and enormous economic advantages for those who control it. Instead of shaping the rules of Arctic navigation, America is left reacting to Russia's dominance and China's growing influence. The supposed leader of the free world is suddenly playing catch-up in one of the most strategically important regions of the planet. There is also the question of resources. The Arctic is believed to contain up to 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its untapped natural gas. Rare earth minerals, critical for technology and defense, are also buried beneath its ice. Russia is already drilling, investing, and exporting from its Arctic territory, securing future wealth and leverage. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and poured billions into scientific research and infrastructure to ensure it has a seat at the table. America, by contrast, has neither the infrastructure nor the political will to compete. This means not only economic loss, but also strategic vulnerability as the resources that will fuel the next century slip out of U.S. reach. Even militarily, the United States is behind. The Pentagon has long acknowledged the Arctic's importance for missile defense, submarine warfare, and power projection. Yet the absence of adequate bases, ships, and logistical networks in the region undermines American capacity to defend its interests. Russia now operates advanced military facilities in the Arctic, complete with radar systems, runways, and missile defenses. China, while less advanced in this regard, has steadily expanded its capabilities. The United States, despite having Alaska as a geographic advantage, failed to build the infrastructure needed to turn that location into a true Arctic hub of power. Geography handed America a winning card, but policy and neglect squandered it. The strategic failure is not confined to government action alone. It extends into public perception. For years, the Arctic barely registered in American political debates. Citizens were told little about its importance, while corporate media focused on domestic squabbles and foreign wars elsewhere. Without public pressure, leaders faced no accountability for their inaction. This silence contrasts sharply with the narratives in Russia and China, where leaders openly tied Arctic development to national pride, security, and future prosperity. America, in effect, lost not only the physical contest for the Arctic, but also the ideological one, failing to inspire its own people to care about what was unfolding. When we put all this together, what emerges is a striking image of decline, a superpower with every advantage. Wealth, technology, geography, and global influence let itself be overtaken by rivals who understood the stakes and acted decisively. This is not simply a tactical mistake. It is a systemic failure of strategy rooted in the structure of the American economic and political system. The Arctic is only the most visible example of what happens when a nation allows short-term profit motives to outweigh long-term strategic planning. America's rivals are building the future in the Arctic. America, meanwhile, has already lost it without even a fight. Short-term profit over long-term planning is not just a policy error in the United States. It is a defining feature of how the American system functions. It is the logic of capitalism, applied not only in corporate boardrooms, but also in the halls of government, and it has profound consequences for how the nation positions itself in the world. The Arctic is a vivid example, but the underlying problem runs deeper. The American ruling class, its corporations, its financiers, and the politicians who depend on their donations, has built an economic and political system incapable of looking beyond the next quarter's earnings report or the next election cycle. That structural limitation explains why the United States has consistently failed to invest in projects that require decades of patient planning, and why rivals like Russia and China, operating under different models, have surged ahead. Corporate America is the clearest place to see this dynamic. A publicly traded company lives and dies by its quarterly results. Executives are rewarded when profits rise in the short term, even if that means hollowing out the company's long-term potential. Share buybacks, dividend payouts, mergers designed to cut costs, and outsourcing to low-wage markets abroad all boost immediate returns, but they undermine innovation, infrastructure, and stability. The same mentality spills into national policy. If investing in Arctic icebreakers or research stations does not deliver quick profits to shareholders, there is no incentive for corporations to push politicians in that direction. Without corporate lobbying, the American political system grinds to a halt. The profit motive dictates the agenda, and the Arctic does not fit that logic because its rewards come decades in the future. Contrast this with how Russia and China operate. Russia does not build icebreakers because they are profitable in the short run. It builds them because it understands they are strategic. China does not pour billions into Arctic scientific research because it expects immediate returns. It does so because it knows the future will reward the groundwork laid today. Both countries can marshal state power to pursue goals beyond quarterly horizons. They can think in decades, even centuries. The United States cannot because its system punishes long-term investments that do not generate fast profits. The result is paralysis when the stakes involve slow building opportunities like the Arctic renewable energy or infrastructure modernization. The political system reflects the same short-term mindset. American politicians live in 2 and 4-year election cycles. They depend heavily on campaign contributions from wealthy donors and corporations, which means their priorities mirror those of their funders. Spending billions on Arctic infrastructure might serve the nation 50 years from now, but it does not generate headlines that help a senator win re-election in 2 years. What does help? Cutting taxes today, deregulating industries today, and delivering favors to donors immediately. The pressure of constant fundraising and perpetual campaigning narrows the time horizon of American politics until it aligns perfectly with the quarterly rhythm of corporate profit. Long-term planning becomes not just undesirable, but impossible under such conditions. This short-termism is not limited to foreign policy. It permeates the entire economy. America's crumbling infrastructure, its underfunded education system, and its inadequate healthcare system are all products of the same logic. Investments that would yield enormous returns over decades are postponed or abandoned because they do not serve immediate corporate or political needs. When it comes to the Arctic, this meant failing to build a modern fleet of icebreakers, failing to establish robust bases in Alaska, and failing to engage diplomatically with Arctic nations to shape the future of the region. Each of these failures stemmed from the same structural weakness: the inability to prioritize collective long-term goals over the private short-term profits of a narrow elite. One particularly striking example is how corporate interests have directed U.S. energy policy. American fossil fuel companies spent decades lobbying to extract oil and gas in the Arctic when it served their profit interest. But once easier opportunities appeared elsewhere, or when shareholders demanded quicker returns, those same corporations pulled back, leaving the region neglected. The government, tied to these corporations through campaign finance and lobbying, mirrored their inconsistency. There was no independent strategic vision that could rise above corporate whims. In effect, national policy became hostage to the immediate profit calculus of Exxon, Mobil, or Chevron, rather than the enduring interests of the American people. The irony is that the very climate crisis threatening the planet is itself a product of short-term thinking. Fossil fuel companies knew decades ago about the dangers of carbon emissions, yet they suppressed the science to protect their profits. Politicians enabled them because it was easier to take campaign checks than to face down powerful industries. The result is a world where the Arctic ice is melting faster than predicted, opening opportunities that forward-looking nations are seizing. Yet the United States, having played such a central role in creating the crisis, remains paralyzed by the same short-term mindset that caused it. This is not merely hypocrisy, it is systemic dysfunction. Meanwhile, the American public is left out of the equation. Ordinary citizens see few benefits from long-term planning because the gains of past investments have been privatized by corporations and the wealthy. When a new highway or energy system is built, it is designed to generate profits for private contractors rather than collective prosperity. As a result, there is little popular pressure for Arctic investment, since people rightly suspect that even if the nation secured resources or shipping routes, the benefits would flow upward to the same small elite. This breeds cynicism and disengagement, further weakening the capacity for long-term national projects. The consequences of this pattern are already visible. Russia and China are setting the terms of Arctic development, while the United States struggles to maintain even a token presence. By prioritizing short-term profits and electoral wins, America has effectively chosen to forfeit its role in shaping the Arctic's future. This is not an isolated failure, but part of a larger story of decline, where the profit motive erodes the ability of a nation to think and act strategically. The logic of capitalism demands immediate returns, and that logic has cost the United States dearly, not only in the Arctic, but in every sphere where patience, planning, and vision are required. Irony of climate change as it relates to the Arctic is as striking as it is tragic. For decades, the United States was a leading driver of the very industrial activities that accelerated global warming, burning fossil fuels, promoting automobile culture, subsidizing oil and gas companies, and exporting a model of development based on carbon-intensive growth. American corporations, with the full support of government policy, profited enormously from this system. Oil giants reaped record profits. Political leaders collected campaign donations, and consumers were told that endless consumption was both natural and patriotic. All the while, the scientific evidence of climate change was growing clearer, showing that the melting of Arctic ice would be one of its most dramatic consequences. In other words, America's pursuit of short-term profits not only deepened the climate crisis, but also created the very conditions that would open up the Arctic as a new frontier of global competition. Yet when the ice began to recede and the opportunities emerged, the United States was unprepared, unwilling, and ultimately unable to seize them. The scientific community had long warned that the Arctic was warming faster than the rest of the planet. In fact, it has been warming at more than twice the global average rate. This acceleration meant that sea ice, once thought permanent, was vanishing at a pace never seen before in recorded history. What this melting represented was not only an ecological disaster, but also a geopolitical shift. New shipping routes connecting Asia to Europe through the Northern Sea Route, and eventually the Transpolar Sea Route would redefine global trade. Vast reserves of hydrocarbons and minerals buried under the ice would suddenly become accessible. Fisheries that had been frozen over for centuries would open for exploitation. Climate change, in other words, was not only a catastrophe, but also a reshaping of the map of power. Nations that understood this began to act decisively. Russia and China moved to establish dominance. The United States, ironically, the very nation most responsible for accelerating this crisis, failed to position itself as a leader in this new era. What makes this particularly ironic is that the American fossil fuel industry knew the truth about climate change decades before it entered the public conversation. Internal documents from oil companies revealed that their scientists were fully aware that burning carbon fuels would melt ice, raise global temperatures, and disrupt ecosystems. But rather than share this information and help society prepare, these corporations funded denial campaigns, disinformation efforts, and political lobbying designed to obscure the truth. They bought themselves decades of profit while robbing the public of the ability to act. In the process, they not only ensured that the Arctic would melt faster, but also ensured that the United States would have no coherent policy to deal with the consequences. The irony is not just that America helped cause the melting, but that it actively prevented itself from preparing for the world that melting would create. Russia, by contrast, did not waste time debating whether climate change was real. It looked at the shrinking ice and saw opportunity. It invested heavily in infrastructure, in icebreaker fleets, in Arctic drilling operations, and in military installations. China, too, took a pragmatic approach. It branded itself a near Arctic state and began funneling billions into Arctic research, shipping investments, and partnerships with northern nations. Both saw climate change as a reality and acted strategically to position themselves for the advantages it would create. The United States, trapped in ideological denial and corporate manipulation, squandered the very head start its own economic system had given it. This irony is sharpened further when one considers America's public posture. U.S. leaders frequently present the nation as a defender of global order, a promoter of democracy, and a force for stability. Yet when faced with the most predictable global crisis of our time, the nation not only failed to mitigate it, but also refused to prepare for its strategic consequences. The gap between rhetoric and reality reveals a deeper weakness. American capitalism was able to extract immense wealth from fossil fuels, but it could not translate that wealth into a strategy for the future. Instead, it allowed other nations to take the lead in shaping a world that American corporations had done so much to create. The environmental irony cannot be ignored either. The melting of Arctic ice is one of the most visible indicators of global climate change, and it poses catastrophic risks for the planet. Rising sea levels, disrupted weather patterns, and collapsing ecosystems. For most of humanity, the retreat of Arctic ice is a warning siren, a signal that the planet is in grave danger. Yet for corporations and governments seeking advantage, it became a business opportunity. What should have been treated as a planetary emergency instead became a scramble for resources and routes. And again, the United States, having been the largest emitter historically, had a moral obligation to lead in addressing this crisis. Instead, it abdicated responsibility, leaving others to set the agenda while it remained paralyzed by domestic divisions and corporate capture. The Arctic, therefore, stands as a mirror held up to the contradictions of American capitalism. It reveals how a system driven by short-term profit can create crises it cannot solve, how it can open doors it cannot walk through. The United States poured its energy into an economic model that destabilized the climate, but when the consequences arrived in the form of new Arctic possibilities, it lacked the vision, the planning, and the political will to act. The very crisis it fueled became an arena for its rivals to outmaneuver it. The irony is not accidental, it is systemic. It is the natural outcome of an economic order that rewards denial, delays action, and privileges immediate returns over collective survival. The melting of the Arctic should have been a moment for America to demonstrate leadership, to pivot toward renewable energy, to build the infrastructure needed to secure its position in a changing world, and to collaborate internationally on managing one of humanity's most fragile ecosystems. Instead, it became the scene of its retreat. The irony of climate change in the Arctic is therefore not just about ice and warming seas. It is about the decline of a nation that profited from creating the crisis, but proved incapable of surviving the world it made. The idea that losing the Arctic without resistance represents an empire in decline captures more than just a regional miscalculation. It speaks to the trajectory of the United States as a global power, where structural weaknesses are eroding its ability to lead, compete, and project influence on the world stage. For over 70 years after World War II, the United States stood as the unquestioned leader of the capitalist world. It wielded unmatched military strength, controlled global financial institutions, and dictated the terms of international trade. But empires do not collapse in sudden explosions. They erode in moments of neglect, oversight, and paralysis. The Arctic episode is one such moment, an early warning of a larger unraveling that points to the limits of America's economic and political model. An empire in its prime would never allow rivals to secure a strategic region without challenge. Historically, dominant powers jealously guarded their spheres of influence, investing heavily to maintain control of key routes, resources, and territories. Britain, at its height, patrolled sea lanes to ensure it dictated global trade. Rome extended its military might to secure grain routes that fed its population. America, in contrast, allowed Russia and China to step into the Arctic uncontested, despite its geographical advantage through Alaska and its immense wealth. This unwillingness or inability to act reflects not strength, but a hollowing out of imperial capacity, where the resources of the empire are consumed internally rather than deployed strategically. One of the clearest signs of decline is overstretch. The United States has spent decades pouring trillions into wars in the Middle East, interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere that have yielded little strategic gain. These endless conflicts drained resources, cost lives, and weakened global credibility. When the Arctic emerged as a vital new theater of competition, the United States had already exhausted itself on wars of choice, leaving little energy or political will to invest in long-term strategy. Russia, by contrast, focused its attention on regions it deemed vital to its survival and future. China concentrated on building economic power and investing in infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The United States scattered its resources, waging wars that undermined its global position while neglecting the arenas that would define the future. Decline is also evident in the inability of a society to mobilize for collective goals. In the mid-20th century, America built the interstate highway system, sent humans to the moon, and created vast research institutions that anchored its global leadership. These projects required long-term vision, state investment, and a commitment to collective progress. Today, by contrast, the American political system cannot even guarantee clean drinking water in some cities, much less mobilize the vast resources required for Arctic dominance. Political polarization, corporate influence, and short-term election cycles have eroded the capacity for national unity around long-term goals. The empire may still possess enormous wealth, but it lacks the political cohesion and social trust necessary to transform that wealth into effective action. The Arctic reveals this weakness with stark clarity. Here was a chance for the United States to demonstrate foresight, to use its resources to build icebreakers, ports, and research stations that would secure influence in the region for decades to come. Instead, the U.S. built almost nothing, relying on a handful of outdated ships while its rivals surged ahead. This is not the behavior of a confident empire. It is the behavior of a power distracted, complacent, and mired in internal contradictions. The empire that once projected strength now hesitates, second guesses, and allows opportunities to pass by. That hesitation is itself a marker of decline. Declining empires also struggle to maintain the narratives that once legitimized their dominance. For decades, America claimed to be the guardian of free markets, democracy, and opportunity. But as it loses ground in arenas like the Arctic, those narratives ring hollow. Other nations see that America cannot back up its rhetoric with action. Allies question whether U.S. leadership truly serves their interests, while rivals sense weakness and move to fill the vacuum. The image of America as a decisive, innovative leader is replaced by an image of dysfunction and drift. When an empire story no longer convinces others, or even its own people, its decline accelerates. Economic contradictions further deepen the erosion. The United States still spends more on its military than the next several nations combined, yet much of that spending goes into sustaining a sprawling global presence rather than adapting to new strategic realities. The empire's resources are locked in old patterns, protecting past gains rather than preparing for future challenges. Meanwhile, the internal economy is marked by staggering inequality, where vast wealth is concentrated in the hands of few, while public goods like infrastructure, healthcare, and education crumble. An empire that cannot sustain its domestic base of support finds it harder to project power abroad. The neglect of the Arctic mirrors the neglect of American workers and communities. Both are casualties of a system that prioritizes elite profit over collective strength. Perhaps the most telling feature of decline is denial. American leaders rarely acknowledge the seriousness of their strategic failures. Instead, they cling to the language of exceptionalism, insisting that the United States remains the indispensable nation. But rivals are less impressed by rhetoric than by actions. They see that America failed to contest the Arctic, failed to invest in infrastructure, and failed to adapt to climate-driven change. The denial may comfort domestic audiences, but it does not alter the balance of power. Empires that refuse to recognize their own vulnerabilities often accelerate their fall because they cannot correct course in time. The Arctic is not the cause of America's decline, but it is a clear symbol of it. A confident empire would have seized the opportunity, coordinated resources, and asserted dominance. A declining empire, by contrast, lets opportunities slip away, consumed by internal dysfunction and blinded by outdated assumptions. The United States, by losing the Arctic without a fight, has revealed that its decline is not merely theoretical. It is already unfolding. The question now is how far that decline will go and whether the nation has the capacity to recognize and reverse it before it becomes irreversible. The loss of the Arctic is not simply the result of a few poor policy decisions or the negligence of particular administrations. It is a reflection of a deeper systemic dysfunction that runs through the economic and political structure of the United States, a nation with immense wealth, advanced technology, and global influence had every tool necessary to secure a dominant position in the Arctic. Yet those tools were never mobilized effectively. To understand why, we must look not at personalities or isolated mistakes, but at the very system that shapes American decision-making. That system is capitalism in its contemporary American form, an order that prioritizes private profit over collective needs, short-term gains over long-term planning, and elite interests over the common good. One dimension of this dysfunction is the way the profit motive distorts national priorities. In a capitalist economy, investment flows toward what is immediately profitable, not necessarily toward what is strategically important for society as a whole. Building a fleet of icebreakers, funding Arctic research, or constructing long-term infrastructure does not yield immediate financial returns for private corporations. Without profit incentives, businesses lobby little for such projects, and politicians who depend on corporate donations see no reason to champion them. The outcome is paralysis. The United States did not fail in the Arctic because it lacked money or expertise. It failed because the system allocates resources based on profitability rather than on what secures the nation's long-term interests. This dysfunction extends into the political sphere. American democracy, as it is structured, is deeply intertwined with corporate financing. Election campaigns are expensive, and politicians must raise vast sums to remain competitive. Those funds overwhelmingly come from wealthy donors and corporations, creating a cycle of dependency. Policies that benefit the general population or address long-term challenges receive less attention than policies that deliver immediate benefits to donors. Thus, issues like Arctic investment or climate preparedness are sidelined in favor of tax cuts, deregulation, and subsidies that enrich the few. The political system mirrors the economic one, short-term, elite-driven, and incapable of tackling challenges that do not fit neatly into the profit framework. The dysfunction is also evident in how knowledge is treated. For decades, scientific research made clear that the Arctic was warming faster than the rest of the globe, with profound implications for trade routes, resources, and global security. Yet this knowledge was downplayed or dismissed because acknowledging it threatened powerful corporate interests, particularly in the fossil fuel sector. Instead of using science as a guide for long-term planning, the system suppressed it to protect profits. Suppression left the public uninformed and the government unprepared, compounding the eventual strategic failure. A society where truth is filtered through the lens of profitability will inevitably stumble in responding to crises that require foresight, honesty, and collective action. Another element of systemic dysfunction is inequality. When wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, national resources are distorted toward serving their interests rather than the broader public good. The richest Americans and the corporations they control saw little personal benefit in Arctic development. Their fortunes could be expanded more easily through stock market maneuvers, offshore investments, and financial speculation. Redirecting wealth toward long-term national projects would have required redistribution, taxation, and public investment steps that threaten elite privilege. Instead, policy was shaped to protect and expand private fortunes, even as public capacity to act strategically withered. The result is a nation rich in private wealth, but poor in collective strength, unable to marshal its resources for tasks that demand unity and long-term vision. This dysfunction is magnified by the cultural narratives embedded in American capitalism. The ideology of the free market insists that government should play a minimal role in directing economic life, that private enterprise should lead, and that state planning is inefficient or even dangerous. Yet the Arctic is precisely the kind of arena that requires collective planning and state-led investment, because the payoff lies decades in the future and the benefits extend to society as a whole. The dominance of free market ideology meant that even when the strategic importance of the Arctic was acknowledged, there was little political appetite for the kind of coordinated state-driven effort that rivals like Russia and China pursued. The United States clung to its ideology while others acted pragmatically, and the cost was the forfeiture of leadership in the region. One of the most revealing signs of systemic dysfunction is the disconnection between public need and state action. Ordinary Americans gain nothing from losing influence in the Arctic, just as they gain nothing from deteriorating infrastructure, unaffordable health care, or rising inequality. Yet the system consistently produces outcomes that harm the majority while benefiting the few. This pattern suggests that the Arctic failure is not an exception, but part of a broader trend. The same forces that block meaningful healthcare reform or climate action also blocked investment in the Arctic. The system is not broken in a way that can be fixed with minor reforms. It is functioning exactly as designed, serving the interests of those at the top while sacrificing the long-term well-being of everyone else. Even militarily, where the United States still maintains immense power, dysfunction is evident. Trillions are spent on weapons systems and overseas bases, yet these expenditures are often shaped by corporate contractors and political lobbying rather than strategic necessity. The military-industrial complex ensures continuous spending on projects that generate profits for defense firms, but little of this vast budget is directed toward preparing for challenges like Arctic competition. The mismatch between spending and strategy underscores how deeply profit motives distort national priorities, even in the realm of security. The loss of the Arctic, therefore, exemplifies a systemic failure that goes far beyond one region. It illustrates how a society dominated by private profit cannot reliably act in its own collective interest. It shows how political institutions subordinated to corporate wealth cannot plan for the long term. And it demonstrates how ideology, inequality, and the suppression of knowledge combine to leave even the most powerful nation vulnerable and unprepared. The dysfunction is structural, not incidental. It explains why the United States, despite having every advantage, surrendered the Arctic without a fight, and why similar failures loom in other areas where foresight and collective action are required. So what do we take from this? The Arctic is gone, not because America lacked power, not because it lacked wealth, but because it lacked a system that could harness those resources for the common good. Capitalism, in its current American form, has proven itself incapable of protecting the long-term interests of its people, its environment, or even its empire. If this system cannot even hold on to the Arctic, what else will it lose? Healthcare, housing, education, democracy itself. My friends, America just lost the Arctic without a fight. Let that be a wake-up call, not just about ice and shipping lanes, but about the system driving this decline. The real battle isn't in the Arctic. It's right here at home, in the struggle to replace an economic system that sacrifices the future for the profits of today. That is the fight worth having. That is the fight we cannot afford to lose. Thank you.